The news of Gene Hackman and his wife being found dead in their Santa Fe home sent shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. What made this discovery even more unsettling was the fact that their bodies had been inside the house for weeks before anyone noticed. How could two well-known people, one of them a legendary actor, go unnoticed for so long? As investigators looked deeper, they realized this was not just a case of natural deaths. There were strange inconsistencies, odd details, and a growing sense that someone knew far more than they were letting on. It all started with a simple welfare check. A neighbor had called the police after noticing that the couple's mail had been piling up. The front door was slightly open, something that seemed out of place. The house itself was quiet, with no lights on and no signs of movement. When officers stepped inside, they were met with an eerie stillness. The air was stale, untouched for weeks. The food left out in the kitchen had long since spoiled. Two of the couple's dogs were running around unharmed, yet one of them had been found dead in its crate. Nothing about the scene made immediate sense. Gene Hackman's body was discovered near the kitchen, slumped over as if he had collapsed suddenly. His glasses lay beside him, untouched, as if they had fallen from his hands. Betsy's body was in the bathroom, with a scattering of pills on the counter and the sink's water long dried up. The forensic team quickly determined that the bodies had been in the house for at least 9 days before being found. The natural breakdown of their bodies had already slowed, and the dry air inside had begun a process of preservation. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of poisoning, no carbon monoxide leaks. Toxicology reports showed no overdoses. It was as if they had both simply stopped existing. A breakthrough came when investigators checked Gene Hackman's pacemaker data. The device had recorded its last activity on February 17th, meaning that was likely the day he had died. But if that was true, why had Betsy not called for help? If she had been alive after his death, what had kept her from reaching out to anyone? The house's security system showed that the doorbell had been turned off and on multiple times in the days before their deaths, but no emergency calls had been made. Then came the next strange discovery. Surveillance footage from a neighboring property captured movement outside the Hackman home. A figure had been seen near the entrance at odd hours, a car had remained parked nearby for long periods, and motion sensors had been triggered inside the house at times that didn't line up with Gene or Betsy's usual routines. Someone had been watching them. Phone records and financial transactions were examined next, and this was when the investigation took an unexpected turn. Gene Hackman's accounts had been untouched after February 16th. No phone calls, no online activity, no bank logins. Then, something even stranger came to light. Someone had attempted to make changes to his estate documents before his death had even been reported. The name linked to these changes was his daughter, Leslie Ann. Investigators dug further into the timeline. Gene Hackman had been a man of routine. Every morning, he walked his dogs at the same time. He checked his mail. He paid his bills like clockwork. Then suddenly, everything stopped. His last recorded online activity was brief, showing no signs that he had been unwell. There were no calls for medical assistance, no sudden withdrawals of money, no purchases that suggested he had been preparing for something. It was as if his entire life had been cut off at once. Meanwhile, Betsy's last bank transaction had been on February 16th, a small, seemingly insignificant payment. But in hindsight, it was the last confirmed sign of life. No calls, no text, no credit card usage. The house had gone completely silent after that day. The more police searched for answers, the more it seemed like someone had been waiting for that silence. Detectives turned their focus to the person who stood to gain the most. Leslie Ann's financial records painted an unsettling picture. She had made attempts to access her father's estate before his death was even confirmed. This was no coincidence. Someone had planned this, and someone had been watching the house long before police ever arrived. Still, there was no direct proof of foul play. The toxicology report showed nothing unusual, the bodies had no signs of trauma, and there was no clear cause of death. But the estate changes, the suspicious phone data, and the unexplained surveillance of the home all pointed to the possibility that someone had orchestrated something far more sinister. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear that Jean and Betsy had not simply died unnoticed. Someone had been aware of their absence, someone had monitored their home, and someone had acted on their deaths before the world even knew they were gone. The real mystery was not just how they had died, but who had been waiting for that moment. Leslie had claimed that she last spoke to her father just a few weeks before his death, insisting that everything seemed completely normal with no reason for concern. But when police examined phone records, they found no calls, no messages, and no proof that the conversation had ever taken place. The last confirmed communication between them had happened far earlier than she claimed, and that immediate contradiction raised serious doubts about her story. As suspicions mounted, investigators turned their attention to her financial records, expecting to see the usual transactions of everyday life. Instead, what they found painted a far more troubling picture. Leslie had already begun making inquiries about her father's estate long before his death was even confirmed. She had reached out to lawyers, asked detailed questions about inheritance procedures, and seemed to be making preparations as if she knew what was coming, despite the fact that, at the time, no one outside the family had any reason to believe Jean Hackman was missing or deceased. The discoveries did not stop there. Legal documents tied to Hackman's assets had been altered, with key information mysteriously changed. The timing of these changes was impossible to ignore because if they had been made before February 17th, the exact date his pacemaker recorded its final activity, it meant that someone had been planning ahead and not just in a harmless way. This was not mere curiosity or innocent financial planning. It was something far more deliberate. Investigators had no choice but to confront Leslie with the inconsistencies in her statements, but her reaction only made matters worse. She became defensive, her explanations became increasingly vague, and when asked why there were no phone records of the calls she insisted had taken place, she had no reasonable answer. The financial transactions tied to her name were even harder to explain, and her inability to provide a logical justification only intensified the scrutiny. Then came the most damning revelation of all. On the very same day that Jean Hackman's pacemaker recorded its last movement, legal discussions regarding his assets had already taken place, despite the fact that no official report had been made about his disappearance or possible death. If the public had no idea he was gone, why had someone already begun shifting things around behind the scenes? With every new piece of evidence, the walls closed in tighter, leaving little room for doubt. The law had caught up to Leslie Ann Hackman, and as the courtroom doors closed behind her, she was about to learn that there was no escaping the consequences of what she had set in motion. And that's all we have for today's episode. Don't forget to give this video a like, smash that subscribe button, and also ring that notification bell while you're down there.